Good morning and welcome to Glasgow Science Centre's Curious About Our Planet Digital Science Festival. My name is Abby and today I'm really excited to be joined by Sheila George from WWF Scotland, and she will be speaking to us about the impacts of climate change on Scotland's land and nature. After the presentation, we will open the floor for questions. So if you would like to ask Sheila a question about her career, her work and experience, please add a comment to our live stream and we'll hopefully get round to as many as we can during that session. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Sheila for her presentation.
Hi everyone, I'm Sheila George and I'm the Food and Environment Policy Manager at WWF Scotland. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the impacts of climate change on Scotland's land and nature. Over the last few years, climate change isn't new, but over the last few years, the public awareness of the impacts of climate change across the globe have really come to the fore. And children have been a massive part of that story with the school climate strikes. So as that public awareness has been raised, political awareness has also been raised, and politicians have got behind the need to act and put in place the measures that we need to respond to climate change and reduce humans' contribution to climate change as well. And it can often seem like an abstract concept. Climate change is something that's happening everywhere else, but there are very real examples of the impact that a changing climate are already having here in Scotland. I'm just going to go through a few of those with you. So we've already experienced a temperature rise of 1 degree, and we're on track for a 1.5 degree increase, potentially as early as 2030. If we were to see a 2 degree increase in temperatures, this could lead to about 18% of insects, 16% of plants, and 8% of invertebrates losing over half of their current range. And in Scotland, climate change is already impacting threatened wildlife. So in Scotland, 1 in 9 species are at risk of extinction from these islands, and that's a hugely worrying stat. And what that means is these species are already under pressure. They're under pressure from loss of habitat, change of food sources, overexploitation, and climate change is just an additional pressure that's on top of that. So this beautiful picture of a capercaillie standing proud. Capercaillie are already being impacted by extreme weather that impacts the survival of their chicks. Too much rain, too much cold weather whenever they're hatching their chicks can have a massive impact. And the little guy in the bottom right corner is a golden plover. They live on moorlands, and again, they're already being impacted by climate change because they have evolved to hatch their young at the same time that the prey species hatch. And what we're seeing is that their prey species are able to adapt much quicker to climate change. So they're hatching earlier, and the eggs of the golden plover are hatching as they always do at the same time. And when they hatch, there's no food available for them. So climate change is already having an impact on these species. We've again already seen temperature rises, but these temperature rises are predicted to continue. Many marine species are expected to shift their range because, as you can imagine, Scottish marine species are adapted to cold water and cold climates, and a number of them can shift further north in search of colder water. But some species are already at the northern edge of their range. For example, the white-beaked dolphin. They don't really have anywhere to go because they're dependent on both cooler water and shallower water. So they can't find that further north, and they are really at risk of extinction of the changing climate. And lots of habitats are also at risk. So the photograph at the background is peatland. Peatlands are really special habitats, and they're formed in waterlogged conditions. They need lots of rain, temperate weather, so not too hot. And they are also really special habitats. They're internationally important for their plant life and the birds and the insects that they are home to. But the way that we manage peatlands impacts their ability to respond to climate change. So about 80% of peatlands in Scotland, or in the UK as a whole actually, are damaged in some way already. They've been drained or burnt, or they've had trees planted on them. And what that means is they're much drier than they should be. And as the climate changes and we see fluctuations in rainfall, the peat starts to dry out. And that means that we see changes in the vegetation structure that they can support, and that in turn changes the insects and birds and all the other wildlife that they're able to support as well. And it also means that they aren't able to behave and perform in the way that they could if they were healthy, to provide benefits for people. And the other picture there is a salt marsh, and similarly, salt marshes is a coastal habitat. Again, it stores lots of carbon. It's really important for biodiversity, but salt marsh is being squeezed up against both land use change, so being squeezed against towns, being squeezed against hard sea defences as temperatures rise and sea levels rise, and they're being lost at a massive rate. So again, that impacts the species that live there, but it also impacts the wider benefits that they provide to society, because these coastal habitats are our first natural defence to climate change, and they protect us from flooding. Farmers are also being impacted. So this slide shows a study that we did in 2018. The beast from the east obviously was the big weather low light of 2018, but there was a whole combination of extreme weather that happened one thing after another that year that really had a massive combined impact. So we had a very wet winter straight into beast from the east with months of snow. Then we went into months of drought conditions and loss of water availability, and we calculated that the impact of that on Scottish farmers was about £161 million just from that 1 year, and that included loss of stock, loss of crops, both because they couldn't get them into the ground and then they couldn't get them out of the ground. It was increase in feed required because there wasn't any grass available, and it had huge wide-ranging impact then also on the farm gate price of some foods. So it's here, it's happening already. And in urban areas, we also know that large parts of Scotland are going to be at risk of flooding. And this is very much linked to how we manage the land and how we manage those habitats elsewhere as well, because the way that we look after our peatlands and our coastal habitats and our farmland can have an impact on how water moves through rivers, and how it moves downstream and how it floods our urban areas. So if peatlands are protected and restored and healthy, they can store an awful lot more water. And when we do get heavy rainfall, it slows the flow. If rivers are wiggly and meandering, the water doesn't flow so quickly. If grasslands and floodplains are well looked after, they hold the water in times of heavy rainfall. And it also means that in times of drought, the land is much better able to store water for the plants and animals that need it as well. So, you know, we often see rural and urban as very disconnected, but they're very, very much connected. And what happens in the wider landscape does impact urban areas. Urban areas will continue to be impacted, particularly as we need to build more houses, and that means we build more houses in areas that are at higher flood risk. And I will say some positive things in a minute, I promise, but we know that the difference between a 1.5 degree increase in temperatures and a 2% increase in temperatures could actually be catastrophic. It sounds like very little, but we're talking about changes from 100% increase in flood risk to 170% increase in flood risk. We're talking about much more severe drought, loss of crops, heat stress in crops, heat stress in animals as well. So in the short term, we might see some benefits to drier, warmer weather, but they'll be counteracted in the longer term by more rain and more unpredictable, more extreme weather. So we need to meet net zero emissions in Scotland by 2045 to be able to have the best chance of limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. Net zero is an abstract term, but what essentially it means is if you look at all of the boxes in blue, they're all sources of greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. So agriculture is one source, transport, energy, residential, all of these things release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that contribute to warming. The green box underneath the dotted line is the way that we can store carbon from the atmosphere and lock it up and counterbalance some of those emissions. And in order to get to net zero emissions by 2045, we need to make all of those blue boxes much smaller, and we need to make the green box much bigger so that it balances out and reaches a net zero. Nature can help us do that, and in fact, nature is an intrinsic part of every pathway to net zero, and Scotland has a natural advantage here. We need to both reduce those emissions, and emissions reduction from industry, from that blue box, is going to be much more about things like improvements in efficiency, reducing waste, investing in technologies, and innovating, whereas capturing and storing more carbon for the box underneath the line, the blue box, means that we need to store more carbon in our soils and in plants. And that means we need to look after nature better. It means that we need to make sure that we're not draining our peatlands, that we're blocking up those drains, that we're not burning them, that we're not planting trees on them, that we are looking after our salt marshes, that we're investing in nature, and that we're getting the balance right between the application of pesticides and fertilizers and the number of livestock that we have on the hills, so that our habitats are really healthy and functioning, and that they're able to deliver for us as well. And we need much more integrated approaches to land use as well. So trees, for example, have a huge capacity to store carbon, and they can also deliver much wider benefits than that. If we plant trees along water courses, they can provide shade. So freshwater habitats are also very susceptible to increasing water temperatures. I mentioned marine species before, but freshwater species are also very susceptible, and trees can actually help protect by providing shading on the water, and reduce those fluctuations in water temperatures. But trees in farms can also provide areas for livestock and wildlife to hide in extreme weather, whether that's extreme wind and rain, or even sun and warm conditions as well. So nature has an awful lot to offer us, and we need to look after it much better. I mentioned salt marshes before as well, and actually, economically speaking, aside from the wider benefits that they can deliver for us, looking after salt marsh is a much more cost-effective way to do flood defence where they exist than building a big wall that needs to be maintained long term, and they only last 10 years before it falls apart. So investing in nature is a huge benefit. Grasslands, if we reduce grazing pressure and we look after our soils, we can actually improve productivity, so we can produce more food with less impact. So there are huge wins in looking after nature, and if we look after it, it can help us respond to climate change. And in turn, that can reduce climate change's impact on these important areas. So we worked with RSPB and Scottish Wildlife Trust earlier last year to come up with 11 actions that we felt were essential for nature's recovery. I mean, this was about biodiversity restoration effectively, but almost all of these actions are really important for also responding to climate change. It talks about expanding Scotland's native woodlands, ensuring sustainable and low impact fishing. Licensing driven grouse moors is about how we manage large areas of our land. Managing deer populations effectively, so reducing grazing pressure on some of these really sensitive habitats like woodlands and like peatlands. Making new developments net positive for nature, and that's about how we plan in our urban areas. So where do we build houses? How do we do that in a way that delivers for nature and climate? How do we plan for sustainable flood management and drainage schemes? How do we create space for nature in our urban areas? And how do we link these wild places better so that animals, when they're exposed to climate change, they have somewhere to move, because there are corridors and stepping stones and networks, so that if they can increase their range, there's space to do so. We need to end burning on peatlands, and we also use compost in our gardens, and that just really isn't compatible with our climate change ambitions anymore. We need to stop digging up peat. We need to stop using it in our gardens. We need better application of nitrogen. So nitrogen fertilizers are a big source of greenhouse gases. Invasive species are much more likely to spread as the climate changes. As climate gets warmer and less suitable for our Scottish species, more invasive species will come. And supporting climate and nature-friendly farming is going to be essential. Farming is a huge land use right across Scotland, and farmers have a big role to play in managing our habitats so that they can help us respond to climate change. We need to protect Scotland's seas and all of the wildlife within it, so that it is able to adapt to these challenges. We need to remember that climate has no borders, and even if we do all of these things, we still need global action on climate change. But Scotland can be a world leader. It is going to be on the stage this year, and it can lead the way, and it can set a really good example. And we have so many opportunities to do so. Thank you.
So we hope you enjoyed that presentation from Sheila on the impact of climate change on Scotland's nature and land. We're now joined by Sheila. Hello.
Hello.
Good morning. It's lovely to have you with us today. Just a quick reminder to our viewers, if you would like to ask a question, please add a comment to our YouTube live stream, and we'll hopefully get round to as many as we can during this session. But we do have a few questions that were sent in earlier this week from some schools, so we'll start off with those. So our first question is from New Mains Primary. This is P6. And the first question is, how can we convince people to change when they don't think climate change is a problem?
I think one of the big important things that we need to do is make it much easier for people to change. So the government has a huge role in this. And we don't always have to change everybody's mind. We just need to make it easier for them to do things that help contribute. So one example would be making active travel much safer and easier, making it much safer to cycle your bike instead of driving the car, making it much easier to walk around our towns and cities. Making towns and cities more connected and accessible to people, so they feel more comfortable doing that. And similarly, making it easier to make healthy and sustainable food choices, making those foods more readily available in schools and hospitals and cafes. So yeah, I think we don't need to change everybody's mind, but we need to change the government's mind so that they can make it much easier for people to reduce their own impact on climate change.
Amazing. Well, definitely introducing more accessible solutions for people sounds great for moving forward with climate change. Our next question is, how has COVID made an impact on climate change?
So in the short term, we've definitely seen a reduction in emissions, especially at the very beginning of lockdown, where we had nobody driving and business and industry pretty much shut down. We did see a fall in emissions. This is likely to be short term. As lockdowns lifted, we have seen emissions rise again. So in terms of climate change as a whole and the trajectory, it'll probably have a fairly short term impact, but we will have learnt lessons from lockdown about what we can do to keep some of those emissions reductions that we managed to get.
Amazing. Yeah, hopefully we can learn a lot from the past year and take some positives out of what we've been through. So that would be amazing. Our next question, what has been your greatest achievement to date within your job, and what do you want to achieve in the future?
And this is a massive question. I had to think about it a lot. So one huge highlight for me was working on a project in Northern Ireland to restore very special peatland there. And I talked about peatlands in my presentation. So they're such important habitats for nature, and they have a massive role to play in soaking up carbon from the atmosphere and locking it in the soils, but we've just not looked after them well. And one huge highlight for me was just seeing that peatland be restored. And I used to have to visit it every week and do some monitoring, and watching it recover as a result of the actions that we took was a real highlight. But I think one other part of my job that I really love is working with partners, whether that's farmers or decision makers or the public, to try and find decisions, to try and find solutions to climate change together. I think that we all have to have a role to play, and those decisions, those interventions have to work for people as well. So I think the partnership part is a massive part of my job I love.
Amazing. Yeah, it's a collaborative effort going forward. It's nice to hear that you're working with lots of different people. Amazing. Our next question is from New Mains Primary as well, and it's from a P7 class. With all the fumes and gases from vehicles and work equipment, what is happening to our health and the environment?
Well, unfortunately, air pollution does have an impact on our health. We know that it can cause breathing problems and it can cause heart problems. And if you've got asthma, it can be quite bad. And some of that air pollution also settles in the environment. So it can pollute our water, and lots of very sensitive habitats and vegetation, plants, are impacted by high levels of pollution as well. But the good news is that we can do things to reduce that pollution. And again, I mentioned active travel before, in our cities and in our towns, driving our cars less, riding our bikes more, walking more, getting public transport more. We've seen that can reduce pollution quite quickly, and we've seen that through lockdown because of COVID. And we can also introduce nature more into our cities and towns. So we know trees can have a really important role to play in buffering us from pollution. So the more that we can introduce nature within, the more nature can help us as well.
Amazing. Awesome. So our next question from the same class, who was your inspiration growing up?
Jane Goodall was my inspiration, probably lots of people's inspiration who work in conservation, but she was a pioneer in primate research in the early days, and she discovered so many things about chimpanzees that we just didn't know, and so many behaviours that were just like us. And yeah, she made me want to get into conservation. Obviously David Attenborough as well, and his amazing documentaries.
Yeah, amazing. It's nice having these figures that we can look up to, and there's new people coming through as well who we can take inspiration from. Amazing. So some more questions from New Mains, another primary 6 class. If you were not a nature conservationist, what other job would you choose? Did you have another dream job as a child?
I did. I wanted to be an Egyptologist. It was a toss-up between Egyptology and zoology, and zoology won. But I was obsessed with pyramids and ancient Egypt and, well, history and just learning about things. I loved that. So maybe one day I'll make a career change, but
it's quite a contrast between what you're doing at the moment. That's really fun. Cool. Next question is from the same class. How has the coronavirus pandemic affected your work as everyone has been busy focusing on it instead of climate change?
Well, I think one positive thing is that the Scottish Government takes climate change really seriously. So they have continued to focus on climate change as well as on COVID. It's had a big impact on the way I do my job, as it has with everyone, and with children learning at home. So a lot of my meetings are on Zoom. I spend a lot of time on the computer when I would have been out and about and meeting people. We've had to find different ways to work and different ways to do things and communicate. But yeah, climate change has still been a priority, so that's been good. So still had lots of work to do.
Amazing. Definitely a very, very different way of working over the past year. But I think we've learned a lot about how we can change going forward. That's amazing. So our next question, have you ever met Greta Thunberg, and what do you think about her and the work she's doing? What can other young people do to help the climate?
I have never met Greta Thunberg, unfortunately, but I think that the work that she and other young people have done over the last few years have really made a massive difference on people's knowledge and awareness of climate change, and politicians' desire to do something about that. And it's made my job an awful lot easier, and because it means that the government knows that people care about climate change. They know that people want to see action on climate change. They know it's important to children, as the generations that are going to be impacted by it if we don't do something. And so it means that they're more likely to listen to me and my colleagues and other NGOs whenever we present solutions. So yeah, really important.
Amazing. It is a persistent voice, which is what's needed sometimes to get things to change. Amazing. Our one last question from St. Peter's Primary. How quickly is the temperature in Scotland rising?
So we've already seen a 1 degree temperature increase in Scotland, and we're on track to see a change of potentially another 1.5 degrees within the next 10 years, another 0.5 degrees in the next 10 years, up to 1.5 degrees in total. And that doesn't sound like an awful lot, but as I mentioned in my presentation, that can bring an awful lot of change. More extreme weather, hotter summers might sound nice, but actually we know that that causes huge impacts on the environment in terms of long droughts and things. So it's changing, but we have time to slow things down, and that's why it's really important that we take the actions we know we need to take now, so that we can get on top of it and minimise those impacts in the future.
Amazing. Yeah, there's still time to do plenty of work to prevent this kind of change. Amazing. So we have some questions coming in from our viewers. Our first question is from Chloe O'Donoghue, if I pronounced that correctly, probably not. Why do you choose to work with the WWF, Sheila?
So WWF is just a really well-known, it's got a great reputation, it works internationally. So in terms of my own personal career, working in Scotland is really important for me now, but it's an international network that has huge opportunities across the world, and that really excites me. I support the work that all of my colleagues across the network do to protect species and habitats, and the action that we take on climate change. So yeah, I'm really proud to work for WWF.
Amazing. Another question here coming in from Sharon Clark on behalf of Ethan in Primary 5 at Burnfoot Community School, asks if we can stop the impact of climate change, or is it just finding a way to manage it?
It's a little bit of both. So we know that the impacts that we're already experiencing from climate change, we will need to adapt to those, but we can mitigate and stop further change from happening if we take action now. So if we can reduce emissions, if we can reach net zero by 2045, then in a 1.5 degree increase world, there will be changes we need to adapt to, but those changes are hopefully manageable, not ideal, but manageable. What we want to avoid is those further changes if we reach 2 degree temperature increases. And obviously, the impacts that are felt globally are disproportionate as well. So even a 1.5 degree increase can massively impact other countries, much more that will impact Scotland.
Yeah, amazing. We have another question there from Jamesy Boy. What could be the consequences of not doing anything about climate change?
So, for example, in Scotland, touching on some of the things in my presentation, we know that extreme weather impacts the way that we can grow food. So in the short term, we might see warmer weather that helps us grow more crops and different crops in Scotland. But actually what we will also see is more pests and more disease come into Scotland that impact those crops and livestock. We'll see the soils dry out, and that means they release more carbon. So that in the long term will impact what we can grow and where. It will dry out habitats. And we know that there are already species that are under pressure from climate change. So if we don't do anything, we can lose them. But just really important to remember that this is the time that we need to act to avoid that. The next 10 years is going to be really crucial. And the more that we can do now, the more that we can avoid those more catastrophic impacts of climate change.
Amazing. So a small window to do some good work, but we can definitely do something about it to prevent those changes. Our next question is from Dino Nugget Are Good for Two. That's an interesting username. What are salt marshes?
Salt marshes are a really muddy coastal habitat, so they're great for wildlife, and you find them along the coasts of Scotland dotted along. We've actually lost a lot of them because, as I mentioned, land use changes the habitat. So some salt marshes have been converted for farming, some have been built upon, and what that means is then we're left with little pockets of salt marsh along the coast that are then squeezed up against the walls that we build and the land that we've converted for them. But yeah, they're a really important wildlife habitat, very muddy, lots of great vegetation. They support loads of coastal birds and insects that the birds feed upon.
Amazing. I think we have another question coming through. Yep, Daniel Frett, is it possible to completely stop gas emissions?
No, it isn't. And that's why the term net zero is recognizing that we will always have some form of greenhouse gas emissions. But if we can capture and absorb some of those, then we can achieve net zero. So we will always have some emissions and we will always be absorbing some emissions. And we need to get that to add up to a reduction. So things like Scottish agriculture, we will always have greenhouse gas emissions from food production because cows burp and they burp methane, and that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And we use fertilizers to grow food, and we will drive cars, and we will travel, and we will need to distribute things, and we will need to heat our homes. So there will always be emissions, but we can reduce those emissions, and we can use nature to help us absorb some of the emissions that we can't reduce.
Amazing. So a more realistic objective is the net zero sort of objective that we're heading for. Amazing. So we have another question here from Abahi D. Is it possible to make an unlimited power source with no carbon footprint?
I think that would be the dream. Someone would get very rich if we can do that. We can have renewable energy that has a lower carbon footprint, and there are lots of things that we can do to reduce the carbon footprint of our power, but yeah, maybe that's one for you to figure out.
Absolutely, that can be a project for all our young viewers watching. We have another question coming through. Grace in Primary 5 at Burnfoot Community School wonders, what's your favourite bird?
Possibly puffin, because they are absolutely beautiful and I love the colours in their beaks, and I love to draw, and they're just really lovely birds to draw.
Amazing. I'm a big fan of puffins as well. They're beautiful birds. We have another question coming through. Why do you think some people think climate change isn't real?
I think climate change is a difficult concept to grasp for people if you haven't experienced the impacts of it directly. It can sometimes seem like it only happens far away, or I think the information that we see is sometimes quite complex as well, and people talk about extreme weather, or they talk about global warming, and often the impacts that we see are actually cold, more snow, or storms. And so the terms that we use are really important in helping people to understand that climate change is real. So a changing climate is something that has always happened in the history of the Earth. But the reason that we talk about climate change as a problem now is that humans' impact has sped that process up, and the rate at which the climate is changing now is unprecedented. So yeah, I think that we need to get much better at communicating to people why the rate of climate change now is so important, and it's so important that we act. I think that we have a responsibility to show people and show people the solutions as well, because sometimes whenever we can identify the solutions and make it easier for people to deliver those solutions, then there's less of a reason to deny that climate change is real.
Amazing. One more question as well coming through. Poppy writes, do you think travel will go up a lot after Corona? If so, will this affect anything?
Again, I think in the long term, we saw a short-term blip in emissions because people were traveling less. I do think there'll be a lot of pent-up appetite to travel more once restrictions are lifted. But in terms of long-term impact on climate change, I'm not sure. It might even out.
Amazing. Another question just popped up. Emily the Ravenclaw, what do you enjoy most about working with WWF?
Well, we all call each other the pandas, and I'm a tartan panda because I work in the Scottish office. So I enjoy being a panda. I enjoy being part of the network, and I enjoy working with all of our colleagues and hearing what they do in their day-to-day jobs. And the two presentations, yesterday's presentation and tomorrow's presentation, you'll hear from two other colleagues. So there's so much exciting stuff happening. There's so many people to learn from, and we all inspire each other. And yeah, I love that about it.
Amazing. I think we have another question coming in from Golden Fred Boy. Will some countries like Australia become uninhabitable if heat rises more?
It's a very real risk that we know we'll lose some island populations, for example, if sea temperatures, sea levels continue to rise. Some parts of countries will become uninhabitable, or we may not be able to grow crops there, and we will see much more extremes of heat, and more extreme weather, and more extreme rainfall, and storms in other places as well. So if it's more important that we take action to avoid that situation. But yes, some parts of the world will be much more impacted by climate change than others.
Absolutely. Another question from Vib. Where do you recommend the job position you are in to younger pupils?
Yes, I would. I think it's a policy role. So whenever you work in policy, I think a lot of people picture conservation jobs as running around the countryside looking at exciting animals, and that's often what I thought about whenever I was younger, and that was the career that I started in. I worked outside a lot, protecting nature, but policy is a really important job as well, because it means that you can secure changes in law or changes in strategy and government policy that allow more nature to be restored and more climate action. So I definitely recommend it. I think it's hugely important. In between delivery and decision making, policy is a big role.
Amazing. We have time for one last question before we wrap up for today. Marta Zillett, what do you recommend we do to be able to work in a position like yours?
So I think it's really important to get lots of experience. So try and volunteer, try and reach out to people who have jobs like me, because I found whenever I was in primary school and secondary school, I knew I wanted to work in nature conservation, and maybe it's changed, and hopefully it's changed, but a lot of the career advice was about how to be a doctor and how to be a lawyer. It was very difficult to get advice. So I think reach out to nature conservation organisations in Scotland, reach out to people who work in roles that you would like to do and hear their path. Take volunteer opportunities where you can. Citizen science is really important, and lots of nature conservation organisations bring on volunteers to do citizen science, to do bird surveys, to do wildlife surveys, to collect data, and that's a really good way to get experience. And in WWF, we have a youth ambassador program for children that are between the ages of 11 and 18. So you can contact our youth engagement officers through our website if you would like to be involved in our youth ambassador program. But yes, just read lots of things, try lots of things, volunteer for as much as possible, get as much experience as you can, and work hard in school, find a degree that makes sense. I did zoology, but any biological sciences degree or ecology degree or even policy degree would get you into a role like this.
Amazing advice for our young people watching us today. So unfortunately, we are out of time for today, but thank you so much for joining us, Sheila, and sharing your knowledge and experience and the work that you do. Thank you also to our viewers for tuning in for Glasgow Science Centre's Curious About Our Planet Digital Science Festival. There's loads more going on over today and tomorrow, so please get involved. But that's it from us today. Goodbye.